India is a very unusual democratic experiment that started in 1947. It is not your French kind of democratic model, which is about a unified people with one language. We have the fourth largest concentration of dollar billionaires in the world. And we have the largest middle class in the world, and we have the largest concentration of the poor in the world at the same time. And then, on top of this massive equality, we have a democratic structure which is divided into 28 or so states, each with its own parliament, legislature, own forms of government. So Indian democratic model is one of the most diverse, and it doesn't. That model wanted to keep the diversity. So you could be a Bengali, and you could be a Muslim, and you could be an Indian, but not necessarily in that order. That was Nehruvian vision, that you don't need to particularly just be an Indian. Like, you need to be French first before you need to be anything else. But our model was not that, at least at the initial framing of it, which is why the whole world watched us with the great eye. India also trumped democratic theories. Democratic theories said that if you're very poor, you don't participate in democracy, or you are not able to participate. But if you look at our voting patterns, that completely fail it, because we see how complex our electoral calculations are. So the democratic experiment in the world is fairly new, and India was a hope there. That, so many different kind of people with so many different languages could still continue to be who they are and still be a nation which offers equal rights, which offers fundamental rights. Now, with the state takeover by Hindutva forces, which is a de-democratizing force, everybody is quite sad, because some fundamental questions on the very validity that democracy as a form of government can work has been reopened now across the world. And India is like the main example in that. So all over the white world, let's say, or the nation state world, they are not happy. They are really not happy with the direction that India has taken. See, the caste system has always been there. And it has been able to trump democracy, it has been able to trump modernity, it has been able to trump all other kind of forces. And in a way, caste gets invisibilized as well. And people don't talk about it once there is a semblance of an independent judiciary, there's a semblance of election, there's a semblance of basic fair rights. But what is happening right now is not palatable for anybody. So whether it's human rights organizations or the different kind of diplomatic missions that exist across the world, principally states who are not authoritarian per se, they're not happy with what is happening in India. And they have been writing to the government of India on this question, that you need to uphold democratic principles, you need to allow people to express their protest. And they're doing it peacefully, and you cannot clamp down on them in this fashion. You cannot use terrorism laws to delegitimize protests and people, young students. I mean, everybody is between the age of 15 and 35, and they were all protesting democratically, and now they're all in prison. And this is an example that India is setting across the world, and nobody is happy. But nobody can do much about it, because ultimately we are a sovereign country. This whole discourse of security has reopened these questions of equality and equal rights and fair trial rights for everybody. So everywhere in the world, and particularly so in India after this present government has come, we have the bogey of national security trying to ride over rights of people, trying to bulldoze fundamental rights, take away your right to protest, your right to speak, your right to have equal citizenship. So, but national security is principally a bogey, because we don't know if the nation is really threatened or not. when we have the first BJP government takeover. We've had Tada before, and the Indian state has always resolved political democratic questions in the Punjab, in Northeast, in Kashmir, through the use of terror laws, by sheer use of force, trying to delegitimize real sociological self-determination questions, questions of neglect in these areas. 2001, 1999, we have the first BJP government, and you know that the BJP has always been the political wing of the RSS, which has believed that India is a Hindu nation. So we have had the war on terror at the same time across the world, trying to, which sort of otherized Muslims as the enemy, as the terrorists, trying to destabilize democracies across the world. And then in India, we've had the Hindutva government trying to say that Muslims don't belong. And these two sort of converge in 2001 in a law like Pota, which you see that just levies suspicion, makes Muslims into a suspect community just by the sheer fact that they are Muslims. Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Muslims have become the principal other of the modern democratic nation-state world. And in India, this question goes back a long time. If you look at the parliamentary debates, if you look at the formation of Kashmir, the inclusion of Kashmir, there were a lot of parliamentarians at that time who were talking about suspect loyalty of Muslims with the creation of Pakistan, the creation of an Islamic state, and India being a secular state. And throughout that time, from the 40s, you see the Hindu right wing sort of develop electorally in the 70s, in the 80s, alongside the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. And you have a lot of riots taking place across the country. And that Hindu nationalism that arose principally brought up this question, whether this country belongs to just Hindus, is it a Hindu country, or Muslims are also equal citizens. So when they came to power, they made use of the international discourse to completely outline Muslims as the enemy, using laws, using technologies, using other forms of media, all kinds of information, misinformation, disinformation, to principally say that the loyalties of Muslims are suspect. And then they used the banning of Simi as the first principal legal foundation of saying that there's a whole Muslim movement that is trying to destabilize the country, trying to terrorize the country. Hindutva is principally based, like the Hindutva project is a very complex project. It's essentially a caste-based project. And the Hindu society is one of the most divided societies because there are so many different groups of people organized in such a hierarchy with Brahmins on top, and a vast majority of the population just supposed to serve Brahmins. And Muslims in that worldview have no place per se. They only have place outside the village, much worse than Dalits. The Hindutva project needs an enemy to be able to keep itself as Hindu, because it's a very divided family. It is a family that is based on a lot of violence. If you look at the history of caste violence in India, I don't think there is any other example of such humongous violence created on people just to tell them that they are low and they need to be shown their place, whether it's Dalits, whether it's traders, whether it's anybody else. Without an enemy, there is no Hindu undivided family. So the best bogey that the BJP had, or the Hindutva had, to say that we are Hindus, because these questions were also raised, Dalits were also converting into Buddhism. This whole unification project, it's a very complex project and it needs an enemy, and Muslims become a very ready enemy there, because anyway they don't belong to this country according to the Hindutva project. But now, in my estimate, there are about 6,000 Muslims over the last 20 years who have been put under terrorism charges, whether under for membership of SIMI or just for conspiracy or for actually carrying out the blast. The actual carrying out the blast is not so many cases. It's about 20-25 at max 30, but big blasts are about 20 of them, and largely concentrated in big cities like Bombay and Delhi. But then if you look at, there have been certain hotbeds of terror like Azamgarh, Darbhanga, Bhatkal. What were these areas? These were rural or semi-rural settlements of Muslims where Muslims were a bit dominant and were in larger numbers. So there was mobility there, and that is where people also took to education. And the terrorism discourse sort of targeted it and took the best of that generation away. So even though these numbers are small, 6,000 in itself is not a very big number. But our studies show that in every blast case, if 10 are arrested, there were 40 who were interrogated and in some ways are then in the clutches of investigative agencies, whether as informers or people whose mental health was severely damaged, community health was severely damaged. So then we're talking of 25,000 people. And this is directly affected. Of course, the effects are on all of us because we see it. It has a chilling effect on all of us as to if we do something like this, then what will happen? So terrorism has been used as a charge against a lot of educated, mobile Muslims to decapacitate them. And of course, there is lynching, you see, and most of the lynching is concentrated in a different kind of area, in sort of rural areas or semi-rural areas. And a lot of the victims of lynchings could also be lower caste, because Dalits have always been lynched forever. And women have always been lynched forever. But it's only now for the first time that Muslims are being lynched, and we're talking about it in a whole different way. So we have about 120 lynching cases in the last 2 decades, or let's say the last 7-8 years in itself. And then we have extrajudicial killings. In UP, we have the highest number of extrajudicial killings. We have about documented, the Yogi government is claiming very large numbers of encounter killings, of which the deaths are only about 50, but they're claiming about 500 and this and that. You put that together with everyday violence. You put that together with the destruction of religious infrastructure, of mosques. You put that together with the destruction of educational infrastructure. AMU and JMI, what happened in Jamia and AMU were just symbolic examples of trying to take away the Muslim right to run established their own institutions. These were old institutions which nobody in their right minds could possibly delegitimize. But even they have been attacked. JNU has been attacked. So imagine what happens in the madrasas. Our studies show that police went inside madrasas in UPs and they literally broke it and beat the students up. So you put the hate crimes together with terrorism charges, you put it with extrajudicial killings, you put it with everyday violence, discrimination, housing discrimination. We are talking of a whole community which is under siege. But of course, we are not the only community under siege. Muslims have had a whole history in India. And Kashmir in itself is an example of a whole community being under siege. And recently in a program, it is true. Nobody has been so pushed back violently like the Kashmiris have been. But if you look at the denotified tribes and if you look at Dalits in certain regions in India, I don't think our history of violence is even comparable to what they have been. So the denotified tribes are those people who were moving around across the country. They were not really settled anywhere. And because they were moving around, there were certain professions that came very naturally to them. Behrupiyas, people who would change shapes, and they've always played a critical role, whether in the freedom struggle or in any kind of struggle, or even in violence. So the British branded them as criminal tribes and put them into registers. So between 1800 and 1870, You have around 6,000 people put under police registers called history sheeters, which is where our colonial practice of policing comes in. And when you have history sheets, then that person, if your name is there in the history sheet, then that person needs to report to the police station every day, or whenever anything happens, they are being picked up. So they have a very long history. Now with POTA coming in, that was, and I wanted to say that today, that was how the legal way how Muslims were put into that kind of space. So for the first time with POTA and all the people who were banned and their friends, they were put into history sheets of bad characters. Now anything happens in that locality, all these characters are picked up. And they're tortured, and their life, your life becomes completely unlivable once you get into the history sheeters. And then if you look at the blast cases across, you look at the Mumbai 7/11 blast case, you look at the Mecca Masjid blast case, you look at all the blast cases in which things actually went wrong, the police picked up Muslims because that's what they do. They take out the history sheets in a certain area and they just trump up a case like that. So yeah, I don't think anybody now, at least anybody is being watched. We're not even talking of surveillance here. We're not even talking of how every madrasa, every mosque, every Muslim gathering is being reported with very extensive surveillance techniques. The history sheet is one very legal body. So yes, it is not an easy situation for Muslims, but I do think that Muslims sometimes forget in this whole war, in this whole fight, in this whole pushback that is happening from the state, sometimes forget that they are not the only ones. That is for sure. If you compare numbers of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances in Punjab, our numbers will never compare to them. What happened between the 70s and the 80s. Same with Kashmir, same with Northeast. Did you look at the number of extrajudicial killings? Legally speaking, we are in a situation of persecution, which is a crime in international law. Legal thresholds are always very high. And I would say that even legally speaking, we are there. And if you look at the events of 2019, if you look at how the only Muslim majority state of Kashmir, its constitutional agreement was rescinded. If you look at the symbol of Hindutva takeover, Babri Masjid, if you look at the 1.2 million Muslims of Assam who were denied citizenship, and if you look at the hate crimes, and if you look at the incitement to genocide that took place in Delhi just before the elections, and very openly, we are definitely in a space of persecution, and persecution is the severe deprivation of human rights of one community as a group, and they are targeted as a group. So we are there, yes, and a lot of international bodies are also saying that. There are several indexes across the world that measure these, and they are all saying it. We are also in a situation of incitement to genocide. That is also there.
My question is the cycle.
Yeah. If you look at what happened in Myanmar, if you compare the situation with India, citizenship changes in Myanmar took place in the 80s when Rohingyas were slowly being denied their citizenship. Genocide happened in 2007. Of course, it was too late by then. Took about 20 years, a little bit more. In Nazi Germany, the first laws around miscegenation, which is the separation of two communities, people not being allowed to marry, Jews not being allowed to marry Germans, Jews not being allowed to be in the high levels of the bureaucracy or in the services. That was around 1931, 32, 33, these laws came in. But Germans are very fast, they do things very fast, so that took a bit less time before the genocidal situation arrived. So we are there. It will take some time if it happens, is my understanding. And one of it in Gujarat has already happened, like you were saying. What was your question here?
I'm asking about the cycle. Like Gujarat happened before that, Bhagalpur happened. how that the whole you can take it for Barbary happened. There's no remorse, like as a society we are not shocked, we are not trying to change or anything, we are just embracing it, like we are validating it again and again, and kind of an ecstasy, like democracy has turned into an ecstasy. We are the one of the only country we have elected a fascist.
You're right, that word is a good word, ecstasy. The particular predicament of our democracy is that, and that is what the previous Nehruvian idea of democracy was not able to do, was that it was limited to the bourgeois, which is very small. Only now it has become about 500 or 400 million. But back then, until the 70s, 80s, it was quite small. Democracy or those ideals never reached the 800 million people we are talking about. And the present regime and the people, they've been in power for 20 years, 25 years, they know that. They know the pulse of those 800 million people. And it is this what they have principally done, that they have allowed this 800 million people, largely poor, largely uneducated, still living in a very casteist ideological space. They allowed them to participate, channelize that anger of non-participation, channelize that anger of not getting the benefits of capitalist democracy. They've allowed them to participate through hate. So hate is the principal electoral strategy. The very participation is based on hate. So of course, I mean, it's not a contradiction. It is the root, and we can. And in India, you could do it. They know, and you know how good certain people are in electoral calculations, how to twist around caste, religion, identity calculations. So, well, that's their forte. So they are not going to be remorseful about it. Of course, they try to save their image internationally on this question. They say a lot of things, but they are not ashamed about it at all. In fact, that's what they want.